The autumn air in Harlem hung heavy that October evening in 1935, thick with the kind of tension that makes men check their exits twice. Inside the Renaissance Ballroom on 138th Street and 7th Avenue, the sounds of Duke Ellington's orchestra filtered through the walls, but the music couldn't mask what was about to happen in the back room. Three men sat at a card table under a single hanging bulb, cigarette smoke curling toward the water-stained ceiling. The fourth man stood by the door, his hand resting inside his coat pocket in a way that made everyone in the room acutely aware of what he was holding. When Casper Holstein looked up from his cards and saw the gun barrel inches from his temple, he didn't flinch. He didn't beg. He simply placed his cards face down on the table and said 5 words that would echo through Harlem's underworld for the next 3 decades. "You better not miss, son." This wasn't supposed to be how legends were born. But sometimes history doesn't ask permission before it rewrites the rules. Casper Holstein wasn't just another numbers runner in Harlem. By 1935, he was the undisputed king of the policy racket, the numbers game that had become the economic lifeblood of Black Harlem during the Depression. While white America was standing in breadlines, Holstein was pulling in $10,000 a day every single day. He'd built an empire from nothing, turning the dreams of washerwomen and porters into a system that employed hundreds and fed thousands. But money alone doesn't make a legend. What made Holstein legendary was what he did with that money. He'd funded the Harlem Renaissance out of his own pocket, literally writing checks to poets and painters when no one else would. He'd posted bail for Marcus Garvey. He'd kept churches open when the banks wanted to foreclose. He'd paid for funerals when families couldn't afford to bury their dead with dignity. In a community where the white establishment offered nothing but exploitation and the mob offered nothing but violence, Casper Holstein had offered something revolutionary: respect. The streets knew him as the Bolito King after the Cuban lottery game he'd mastered in his youth. But the people who mattered, the grandmothers who played their grandchildren's birthdays, the ministers who kept his donations quiet, the musicians who performed at his clubs, they knew him as the man who'd proven that a black man could build something the white power structure couldn't touch, or so everyone thought. The man holding the gun was named Vincent Call, though Harlem knew him by a different name, Mad Dog. He'd earned that nickname the hard way, leaving a trail of bodies from the Bronx to Brooklyn that made even Dutch Schultz nervous. Call was 23 years old and had already killed more men than most mobsters see die in a lifetime. He was young, white, and absolutely convinced that the world owed him everything. And right now, he wanted what Casper Holstein had. The setup had been simple, almost insultingly so. Call had sent word through intermediaries that he wanted to discuss business opportunities, a partnership that would allow Holstein's numbers operation to expand into white neighborhoods. It was the kind of proposal that might have made sense coming from someone else, someone with connections and credibility. But coming from Mad Dog Call, it was an obvious shakedown dressed up in silk. Holstein had come anyway, not because he was naive, but because he understood something that Call didn't. In Harlem, reputation was currency. And you didn't build the kind of reputation Holstein had by hiding from threats. The 2 other men at the table were Call's associates, muscle, not brains. They'd positioned themselves carefully, blocking the room's only exit, standard intimidation tactics. The kind of move that worked on scared shopkeepers and desperate gamblers. But Casper Holstein hadn't built an empire by being scared or desperate. "Here's how this works," Call had said, his voice carrying the nasal Queen's accent that marked him as an outsider in Harlem. "You got a nice operation here, real nice, but you're operating in a city that belongs to people who don't look like you. So you're gonna pay a tax. Call it insurance." The words weren't original. They were the same words 1,000 two-bit gangsters had used on 1,000 small-time operators. Protection rackets were as old as organized crime itself. What made this moment different was who was saying them and who was hearing them. Holstein had listened patiently, his dark eyes never leaving Call's face. He'd heard men like this before, men who confused violence with power, who thought that being willing to kill meant you deserved to rule. He'd watched them come and go, burning bright and dying young, leaving nothing behind but graves and grieving mothers. When Call finished his pitch, Holstein had done something unexpected. He'd laughed. Not a nervous laugh or a mocking laugh, but the genuine sound of a man who'd just heard something absurd. "You think you're the first person to point a gun at me?" Holstein had asked, his voice carrying the slight Caribbean lilt that marked his Virgin Islands roots. "Son, I've had bigger men than you try to take what's mine. They're all dead or in jail. You know why I'm still here?" That's when Call had pulled the gun, a nickel-plated .38 revolver that caught the light from the hanging bulb. He'd pressed it against Holstein's temple, close enough that the metal touched skin. And that's when Casper Holstein said the words that would define this moment forever. "You better not miss, son." The room went dead silent. Even the muffled jazz from the ballroom seemed to fade away, as if the entire building was holding its breath. The two men at the table shifted uncomfortably, suddenly aware they were witnessing something that went beyond a simple shakedown. This was a test of wills between two different kinds of power. The power that came from being willing to kill, and the power that came from being unafraid to die. Vincent Call's hand trembled. It was barely noticeable, just a slight quiver in his trigger finger, but in that cramped back room under that single hanging bulb, it might as well have been an earthquake, because everyone saw it. And in the world they inhabited, where reputation was built on the edge of a razor, that tremor was the difference between respect and ridicule. "You think I won't do it?" Call's voice had lost some of its edge. The Queen's accent seemed more pronounced now, less threatening and more defensive. "You think I came here to play games?" Holstein still hadn't moved. His cards remained face down on the table, his hands visible and relaxed. But his eyes, those eyes that had stared down police captains and mob bosses, that had watched the Virgin Islands fade into the distance when he was just a boy looking for a better life, those eyes held something that made Call's finger freeze on the trigger. "I think," Holstein said slowly, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty, "that you came here because someone told you I was an easy mark. Some Italian downtown, probably. Told you the numbers game in Harlem was ripe for taking. Told you that a black man with money was just holding it until a white man came to claim it." One of Call's associates glanced toward the door. It was a subtle movement, but Holstein caught it. He was reading the room the way a chess master reads a board, seeing 3 moves ahead while his opponent was still trying to figure out the current position. "And I think," Holstein continued, "that whoever sent you here didn't tell you the whole story. Didn't tell you that every cop from here to City Hall is on my payroll. Didn't tell you that Dutch Schultz tried this same play 2 years ago and had to send flowers and an apology to keep from starting a war. Didn't tell you that the last white boy who put a gun in my face is currently feeding fish in the East River." The tremor in Call's hand became more pronounced. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the October chill seeping through the walls. He'd killed men before, plenty of them. But he'd always killed from ambush, from moving cars, from positions of overwhelming advantage. He'd never had to look a man in the eyes, while that man calmly explained why pulling the trigger would be the last mistake he ever made. "Here's what's going to happen," Holstein said, and his voice carried the tone of a man stating facts rather than making threats. "You're going to lower that gun. You're going to walk out of here with your associates, and you're going to remember this moment every time you think about coming back to Harlem." "And if I don't?" Call's voice cracked slightly on the last word. Holstein smiled, and it wasn't a pleasant expression. It was the smile of a man who'd survived things that would have broken lesser men, who'd built an empire in a city that didn't want him to have a dime, who'd learned that true power wasn't about who was willing to kill. It was about who was willing to die for what they'd built. "Then you pull that trigger," Holstein said simply. "And before your next heartbeat, there'll be 20 men in this room. They've been waiting outside since before you got here, watching, listening, making sure their king stays safe." Call's eyes darted toward the door, then back to Holstein. The calculation was written across his face. Was this a bluff? Could Holstein really have that kind of security without anyone noticing? In the Italian neighborhoods, in the Irish territories, this kind of setup would be obvious. But Harlem operated by different rules. In Harlem, the shoeshine boy could be a lookout. The janitor could be an enforcer. The woman selling flowers on the corner could be the one who made the call. "And even if you get lucky," Holstein continued, his voice never rising above conversational level, "even if you put a bullet in my brain and somehow make it out of this building alive, you'll have marked yourself as the man who killed the Bolito King. Every number runner, every policy banker, every person in Harlem who depends on this operation for their bread, they'll be looking for you. Not for revenge, for survival. Because if you can kill me and get away with it, that means the system falls. And when the system falls, people starve." This was the part that Vincent Call hadn't understood when he walked into this room. He'd thought he was shaking down just another racketeer, just another criminal who'd built his fortune on other people's desperation. What he'd failed to grasp was that Casper Holstein wasn't just running a numbers game. He was running an economy. He was the bank, the employer, the safety net, and the power structure all rolled into one. In Harlem's segregated world, where white banks wouldn't give loans and white businesses wouldn't hire, Holstein's operation was what stood between survival and starvation for thousands of families. The gun slowly began to lower. It wasn't a conscious decision, not really. It was the inevitable result of a young man's survival instinct overriding his pride. Call had killed plenty of men, but he'd never faced someone who made him understand that pulling the trigger would mean his own death, not in some distant future, but immediately, inevitably, and without mercy. The barrel of the .38 dropped another inch, then another. Call tried to make it look like a choice, like he was the one deciding to show mercy rather than the other way around. But everyone in that room knew the truth. They'd all just watched Vincent Mad Dog Call, the man who'd shot up a crowd of children to get at a rival, the man who'd made Dutch Schultz himself nervous, back down from an unarmed man sitting at a card table. But Casper Holstein wasn't finished, because this wasn't just about winning a confrontation. This was about sending a message that would echo through every mob social club, every police precinct, every backroom deal in New York City. This was about making sure that what happened in this room tonight would ensure it never happened again. "Before you go," Holstein said, his voice still carrying that same calm authority, "I want you to understand something. You came here thinking you could take what's mine because you're white and I'm not. Because you've got a gun and a reputation for violence. Because in every other part of this city, that's how the game works." Holstein slowly stood up from his chair. The movement was deliberate, unthreatening, but it shifted the power dynamic in the room completely. Now he was the one standing towering over the table, while Call and his associates looked suddenly smaller, younger, more aware of how badly they'd miscalculated. "But Harlem isn't every other part of the city," Holstein continued, walking slowly around the table. His movements were measured, unhurried, like a professor delivering a lecture to students who desperately needed to learn the lesson. "In Harlem, respect isn't taken, it's earned. And you can't earn it with a gun, because every man in this neighborhood has looked down a barrel at some point in his life. You can't earn it with violence because we've survived worse than anything you could imagine." Call's gun was now pointed at the floor, his arm hanging loosely at his side. His associates had gone completely still, statues carved from fear and humiliation. The one nearest the door still hadn't moved, hadn't made a single gesture toward escape. Because they all understood now that Holstein had been telling the truth, there were people outside that door, waiting, watching, ready to respond if the wrong choice was made. "You know what the difference is between you and me?" Holstein asked, and it was clearly a rhetorical question. You walk into a room and people are afraid of what you might do. I walk into a room and people are grateful for what I've already done. You rule through fear. I lead through respect. And son, fear only works until someone stops being afraid. The words hung in the air like smoke from the forgotten cigarettes burning in the ashtray on the card table. Outside, the jazz band had transitioned to a slower number, something melancholy and bluesy that seemed to underscore the weight of the moment. Somewhere in the building, someone laughed, a sound so normal and out of place that it made the tension in the back room feel even more surreal. You came here tonight thinking you were going to make an example of me, Holstein said, moving closer to Call now, close enough that the younger man had to tilt his head back slightly to maintain eye contact. But instead, you've become the example. Every two-bit gangster who thinks about trying what you tried tonight will hear this story, and they'll learn what you just learned. Yeah? Call's voice was barely above a whisper, the bravado completely drained from it. What's that? Holstein leaned in, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute truth. That the man who's unafraid to die is the most dangerous man in any room, because he's already won. You can take his money, you can take his territory, you can even take his life, but you can't take his dignity, you can't make him bow, and you can't make him afraid. For a long moment, the two men stood there, locked in a silent battle of wills that had already been decided. Call's hand tightened around the grip of his gun one last time, a final flicker of the violence that had made him famous in other neighborhoods. But it was just a flicker, a dying ember of the aggression he'd walked in with. Get out, Holstein said finally, stepping back and gesturing toward the door. Take your associates, take your gun, take whatever pride you've got left, and don't ever come back to Harlem trying to collect tribute from me or anyone else who works with me. Call moved toward the door, his movements jerky and uncertain, like a puppet whose strings had been cut and then hastily reattached. His associates followed, careful not to turn their backs on Holstein, still half expecting the ambush the Bolito King had threatened. When Call's hand touched the doorknob, he paused, some last vestige of pride demanding that he have the final word. This isn't over, he said, but even he didn't sound convinced. Holstein picked up his cards from the table, studied them briefly, then looked back at Call with an expression that might have been pity. Yes, it is. You just don't know it yet. The door opened, and the three men stumbled out into the hallway where the music was louder, where the world was still spinning normally, where people were dancing and drinking and living their lives without any idea that history had just been made in the room they were walking past. The door closed behind them with a soft click that sounded, in that moment, like a coffin lid shutting on Vincent Call's reputation in Harlem. Casper Holstein stood alone in the back room, the hanging bulb casting long shadows across the card table. He reached for his cigarette, took a long drag, and allowed himself a single moment of satisfaction. The moment the door closed, Holstein heard it, the subtle shift in the hallway outside. Footsteps that had been positioned at strategic points suddenly relaxed, moved, redistributed. He hadn't been bluffing about the security. 6 men had been stationed in that hallway from the moment Vincent Call walked into the Renaissance ballroom. Another 4 had been positioned at street level, watching the exits. 2 more had been in the balcony overlooking the main dance floor, their eyes never leaving the back hallway. This was how Casper Holstein had survived in a business where most men didn't last 5 years. Not through recklessness or bravado, but through meticulous preparation and an understanding that in Harlem, survival meant community. Those 12 men weren't just bodyguards. They were the husband of a woman whose medical bills Holstein had paid, the nephew of a minister whose church Holstein had saved from foreclosure, the brother of a numbers runner who'd gotten a fair shake when other operators would have cheated him. They weren't protecting Holstein because he paid them, though he paid them well. They were protecting him because he'd protected them first. But Holstein also knew that what had just happened in this room would ripple outward, and those ripples could either strengthen his empire or shatter it completely. Vincent Call wasn't just some nobody with a gun. He was connected to the Italians downtown, had done work for the Cosa Nostra families, had earned his reputation as someone who finished what he started. Backing down from an unarmed black man would wound Call's pride deeper than any bullet could, and wounded pride made men unpredictable. The door opened again, but this time it was a familiar face. Raymond Ray Johnson stepped into the room, closing the door quietly behind him. Ray was Holstein's second-in-command, a former Pullman porter who'd proven himself during the race riots of 1919, standing shoulder to shoulder with Holstein when white mobs had tried to burn black Harlem to the ground. If Holstein was the king, Ray was the general who made sure the kingdom didn't fall. "You got lucky," Ray said. "No preamble, no congratulations. Just the blunt assessment of a man who'd seen too much to be impressed by close calls." "Wasn't luck," Holstein replied, finally sitting back down at the card table. His hands were steady, his voice calm. But Ray knew him well enough to see the slight tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw was set just a fraction tighter than normal. "I read him right. He's young, impulsive, but not stupid. Stupid would have pulled the trigger. Smart enough to recognize when the odds aren't in his favor." "Smart enough to come back with more men," Ray countered, moving to the window and glancing down at 138th Street below. The sidewalks were crowded with the usual Saturday night traffic. Couples heading to the clubs, hustlers working their corners, uniformed police officers walking their beats with the casual confidence of men who knew their envelopes would be waiting for them at the end of the shift. Word's going to spread. By tomorrow morning, every mobster from Little Italy to Hell's Kitchen is going to know that Mad Dog Call backed down from you. That kind of humiliation doesn't sit quiet. Holstein knew Ray was right, but he also knew something else. Let them talk. Let the story spread. Because the story that spreads won't be about Vincent Call. It'll be about what happens when you disrespect Harlem. The next 72 hours would prove Holstein right in ways that neither man could have fully anticipated. By Sunday morning, the story had already transformed. It wasn't just passing through the usual channels, the barbershops and speakeasies, the street corners and church steps, where Harlem's oral history was written and rewritten with each telling. It had jumped the tracks, spreading into the white neighborhoods downtown, filtering through the mob social clubs where made men played cards and discussed territory like generals studying maps. The story that reached Dutch Schultz's ears over breakfast Monday morning was a masterpiece of strategic embellishment. According to the version that found him, Casper Holstein hadn't just faced down Vincent Call. He'd done it with 20 armed men in the room, while simultaneously having the entire block surrounded by Harlem's most dangerous enforcers. The gun at his temple had been treated like an inconvenience rather than a threat, and Call had reportedly left the Renaissance ballroom at a near run, sweating through his expensive suit. Some of it was true. Most of it was exaggerated. All of it served Holstein's purpose perfectly. Schultz, who controlled the numbers racket in the Bronx and had been eyeing Harlem expansion for years, made a phone call that afternoon to his associate Legs Diamond. The message was simple. Stay out of Holstein's territory, not worth the headache. But Vincent Call heard a different version of events. In his version, the one that reached him through sympathetic ears and wounded pride, he'd been ambushed, outnumbered, and forced into a tactical retreat by overwhelming force. Not a loss of nerve, not a failure of will. Just a smart, strategic decision to withdraw when the odds were stacked against him. This version allowed Call to save face with his associates, but it did something more dangerous. It made him angry. Not the hot, explosive anger that leads to immediate violence, but the cold, calculating fury that plans revenge in detail, that waits for the perfect moment, that turns obsession into action. 3 days after the confrontation at the Renaissance Ballroom, Call started making calls. Not to his usual associates or mob connections, but to a different kind of contact. He reached out to corrupt police officers, the ones who'd been on Holstein's payroll but felt underpaid, underappreciated. He contacted rival numbers runners in Harlem who'd been pushed out by Holstein's expansion, men with grudges and empty pockets. He talked to politicians in Tammany Hall who resented how much power a black man had accumulated in a city they believed belonged to white men. Call was building an alliance, piece by careful piece. And at the center of his plan was a simple goal: destroy Casper Holstein's empire so completely that Harlem would have no choice but to accept new management. But intelligence moved both ways in New York City. By Wednesday, Holstein's network had picked up whispers of Call's activities. Ray Johnson brought the reports to Holstein's office above the Turf Club on 136th Street, spreading them out on the desk like evidence in a trial. Holstein studied the reports in silence, his reading glasses perched on his nose, his expression unreadable. The autumn sunlight streaming through the office windows caught the smoke from his cigar, creating shifting patterns in the air that seemed to mirror the complexity of the situation unfolding before him. Each piece of paper represented a thread in Call's web. A cop approached here, a rival contacted there, a politician's palm greased somewhere else. "He's smarter than I gave him credit for," Holstein said finally, removing his glasses and rubbing the bridge of his nose. "Not going for the direct approach, going for the foundation instead." Ray nodded, pointing to one particular report. "This one worries me most. Captain William Harrigan, 32nd Precinct. He's been on our payroll for 3 years, but Call's offering him double, plus immunity if things go sideways. Harrigan's the kind of man who'll sell his own mother if the price is right." Holstein had dealt with men like Harrigan his entire career, the corrupt cops who saw badge and gun as tools for personal enrichment rather than public service. In a way, Holstein preferred them to the honest ones. Honest cops couldn't be reasoned with, couldn't be negotiated with, couldn't be convinced to look the other way when business needed to be conducted. But corrupt cops, they were just businessmen in uniform, and businessmen understood leverage. "Set up a meeting with Harrigan," Holstein said, standing and moving to the window. Below, 136th Street bustled with afternoon activity. Women carried groceries, children played stickball in the street, men gathered on stoops discussing everything from Joe Louis's latest fight to Roosevelt's new policies. This was what Holstein was really protecting, not just his numbers operation, but the ecosystem that operation supported. "Tell him I want to discuss his future with the department." "You think you can outbid Call?" Ray asked, skepticism clear in his voice. "I don't need to outbid him," Holstein replied, a slight smile crossing his face. "I need to make Harrigan understand that taking Call's money is the last decision he'll ever make as a free man." The meeting was arranged for Thursday evening at a chop house in Midtown, neutral territory where neither Holstein nor Harrigan had to worry about being ambushed on their own turf. Holstein arrived with only Ray, a deliberate choice that signaled confidence rather than fear. Harrigan came alone, which signaled something else entirely: desperation. Captain William Harrigan was a man whose face told his story. Red-veined nose, bloodshot eyes, the slight tremor in his hands that spoke of too many nights spent with a bottle for company. He was in his mid-40s but looked older, worn down by years of living two lives, the public face of law and order and the private reality of corruption and compromise. He'd been a good cop once, or so the stories went, but good cops didn't get rich, and Harrigan had developed expensive tastes. "You know why you're here?" Holstein said after they'd ordered. "No pleasantries, no small talk, just business." Harrigan took a long drink of his whiskey before responding. "I got an offer, a good offer, better than what you're paying. Don't take it personal, Holstein. It's just mathematics." "Mathematics," Holstein repeated, the word carrying an edge of amusement. Let me give you some different mathematics to consider, Captain. How many years do you figure you'll serve if I provide the district attorney with documentation of every payment you've received from me over the past 3 years? Documentation that includes dates, amounts, and what you provided in exchange. The color drained from Harrigan's face. His hand tightened around his whiskey glass hard enough that his knuckles went white. You wouldn't. That would expose your own operation. Would it? Holstein leaned back in his chair, completely relaxed. See, that's where your mathematics fails you, Captain. You're thinking like a white man in a white man's world, where exposure means mutual destruction. But I operate differently. If I go down, I take a dozen cops with me, maybe 2 dozen. I spend some years in prison, come out to a hero's welcome in Harlem. The man who stood up to corrupt police. The man who exposed the system. Holstein paused, letting that sink in before continuing. But you? You're just another dirty cop. No community to protect you. No reputation to fall back on. Your wife leaves, your kids change their names, and you spend the next 20 years in Sing Sing sharing a cell with men you helped put there. How do you think that mathematics works out for you? Harrigan's hand was shaking visibly now, the whiskey in his glass creating tiny ripples like a miniature earthquake. Ray watched silently, his expression neutral, but his presence adding weight to Holstein's words. This wasn't a negotiation. It was a sentencing hearing where Harrigan was just now realizing he'd already been convicted. Call said you'd try to intimidate me, Harrigan said, but his voice lacked conviction. Said you'd make threats you couldn't back up. Did he tell you what happened to the last police captain who came after me? Holstein asked, his tone conversational. Captain Thomas Morrison, 28th Precinct, 1931. Decided he was going to make a name for himself by taking down the Bolito King. Raided my operations, arrested my people, even put me in a cell for 48 hours. Harrigan nodded slowly. He knew the story. Every cop in New York knew the story. Morrison's retired now, Holstein continued. Living in a small apartment in the Bronx on a pension that barely covers his rent. His wife left him. His children don't speak to him. He drinks alone every night at a bar where nobody knows his name. You want to know why? Why? The word came out as barely a whisper. Because the moment he came after me, I made sure every criminal in New York knew that Captain Thomas Morrison was untouchable. Couldn't be bribed, couldn't be reasoned with, couldn't be compromised. Suddenly, every mobster, every racketeer, every two-bit criminal stopped paying him. His income dropped to nothing overnight. His fellow officers resented him for making them look bad. His superiors blamed him for disrupting the arrangement that kept the city running smoothly. He became a pariah in his own department. Holstein leaned forward, his eyes locked on Harrigan's. I didn't have to lay a finger on him. I didn't have to threaten him or his family. I just had to let the system he'd thrived in turn against him. And it did, because corrupt systems protect themselves. Morrison thought he was fighting me. He never realized he was fighting everyone. The food arrived, but neither Harrigan nor Holstein touched their plates. Ray cut into his steak with deliberate precision, the knife scraping against china in a way that emphasized the silence at their table. So here's your real mathematics, Captain, Holstein said, finally picking up his fork, but using it to gesture rather than eat. Vincent Call is offering you money. Good money, I'm sure. But money only spends if you're alive and free to spend it. I'm offering you something more valuable. I'm offering you the chance to keep living the life you've built, your house in Queens, your position in the department, your reputation, such as it is. Harrigan stared at his untouched plate, the reality of his situation settling over him like a burial shroud. He'd thought he was playing both sides, maximizing his profit. But he'd forgotten the fundamental rule of corruption. You can only serve one master at a time, because the moment you try to serve two, you're useful to neither. What do you want from me? Harrigan asked finally, defeat evident in every syllable. I want you to tell me everything Vincent Call told you, every name he mentioned, every plan he outlined, every piece of his strategy that he shared thinking you'd be his inside man. And then I want you to go back to him and tell him that you're in, that you've seen the documentation I have on you and you're more afraid of me than you are loyal to your pension, that you'll help him take me down. Harrigan's eyes widened. You want me to be a double agent? Against Call? He'll kill me if he finds out. He'll kill you anyway. Ray spoke for the first time, his voice flat and matter-of-fact. Once you've served your purpose, men like Call don't leave witnesses. You think he's going to let a corrupt cop walk around knowing everything about how he took down Casper Holstein? The moment this is over, you're a liability. And Call handles liabilities with a bullet. The truth of those words hit Harrigan like a physical blow. He reached for his whiskey again, draining the glass in one desperate gulp. His hand trembled as he set it back down, and for a moment he looked like he might cry. A middle-aged cop who'd gotten in over his head, who'd thought he could play in the big leagues and was just now realizing he was drowning. I need a guarantee, Harrigan said, his voice hoarse. I need to know that if I do this, if I feed you information and play both sides, that you'll protect me when it's over. Holstein considered this for a long moment, studying Harrigan the way a jeweler might study a flawed diamond, seeing the cracks, assessing whether it could still be cut into something useful. Finally, he nodded. You give me everything Call's planning, you help me turn his own strategy against him, and when this is over, you get to retire. Full pension, no charges, no documentation leaked. You move somewhere quiet, maybe Florida, maybe California, and you live out whatever years you have left without looking over your shoulder. But you cross me. You hold back information. You warn Call even once, and I bury you so deep they'll need a mining operation to find what's left. It wasn't a negotiation. It was a sentencing with a chance at parole for good behavior. Harrigan nodded slowly, and for the next 2 hours, he talked. He laid out everything Vincent Call had told him. The plan to coordinate raids on Holstein's operations, the strategy to turn Holstein's own numbers runners into witnesses against him, the scheme to plant evidence that would tie Holstein to murders he hadn't committed, the ultimate goal of getting Holstein sentenced to Sing Sing, where Call had connections inside who could ensure he never walked out alive. It was comprehensive, ruthless, and exactly the kind of plan that would have worked if Harrigan hadn't been sitting in this chop house confessing everything to the man he was supposed to help destroy. By the time Holstein and Ray left the restaurant, the autumn night had turned cold, the kind of October chill that promised an early winter. They walked in silence for 2 blocks before Ray finally spoke. You trust him? Not even a little bit, Holstein replied, lighting a fresh cigar. But I don't need to trust him. I just need him to be more afraid of me than he is of Call. Fear's a more reliable motivator than loyalty ever was. The next morning, Holstein convened a meeting of his top lieutenants in the basement of the Turf Club. 8 men gathered around a table that had seen countless strategic discussions over the years, the planning sessions that had built Holstein's empire from a single policy bank into the most powerful numbers operation in Harlem. These weren't just employees, they were partners in an enterprise that had changed all their lives. Holstein laid out Call's plan with clinical precision, watching his lieutenants' faces as they absorbed the scope of the threat. When he finished, the room erupted in angry voices, men calling for preemptive strikes, for Call to be eliminated before he could execute his strategy. But Holstein raised his hand, and the room fell silent. We don't respond with violence, he said firmly. We respond with intelligence. Call's plan requires coordination, cops, witnesses, planted evidence, inside connections at Sing Sing. It's complex, which means it's fragile. We're going to dismantle it piece by piece until there's nothing left but Call himself, isolated and exposed. Over the next 3 weeks, Holstein's organization moved with surgical precision. The corrupt cops Call had approached found themselves suddenly transferred to precincts far from Harlem, reassignments that came from high enough in the department that they couldn't be questioned. The numbers runners Call had tried to flip received visits from Holstein's representatives, not threats, but reminders of who had fed their families during the Depression, who had posted bail when they were arrested, who had paid for funerals when their relatives died. The evidence Call planned to plant never materialized because the officers who were supposed to discover it found themselves under investigation by Internal Affairs for unrelated corruption. Investigations that mysteriously began just days after they met with Call. The connections at Sing Sing that were supposed to ensure Holstein's death in prison suddenly found themselves paroled early thanks to paperwork that bore the signatures of judges who owed Holstein favors going back years. Call's intricate web of conspiracy collapsed not with a bang, but with a whisper, each thread severed so quietly that by the time he realized what was happening, there was nothing left to salvage. The cops stopped returning his calls. The witnesses disappeared. The planted evidence vanished. The inside connections evaporated. And through it all, Captain William Harrigan fed Holstein every desperate adjustment Call made to his crumbling plan, every new approach he tried, every moment of panic as he watched his revenge plot disintegrate in real time. By mid-November, Vincent Mad Dog Call found himself in the same position he'd forced Casper Holstein into 6 weeks earlier, sitting in a room, acutely aware that he'd lost, trying to figure out how to salvage some scrap of dignity from complete defeat. The phone call came on a Tuesday afternoon, 3 days before Thanksgiving. Holstein was in his office above the Turf Club, reviewing the week's receipts, when Ray walked in and placed a slip of paper on the desk. On it was written a single phone number and 3 words. Call wants to meet. Holstein looked at the paper for a long moment, then up at Ray. Where? Says it's your choice. Anywhere you want. Says he'll come alone, unarmed, just wants to talk. It was the kind of request that could be a trap, but Holstein doubted it. A man who was winning didn't ask for meetings on his enemy's terms. A man who was winning dictated the conditions. This was the sound of surrender, even if Call himself didn't want to admit it yet. The Renaissance Ballroom, Holstein said finally. Same room where this started. Thursday evening, 8 o'clock. Ray raised an eyebrow. You sure? That's making a statement. That's exactly the point, Holstein replied. If we're going to end this, we end it where it began. Thursday evening arrived cold and clear, the kind of November night where your breath misted in the air and the sidewalk seemed to ring under your footsteps. The Renaissance Ballroom was hosting its usual Thursday night dance, the sounds of a swing band filtering through the building as couples spun across the polished floor. But in the back room where this had all started 6 weeks ago, there was only silence and waiting. Holstein arrived first, deliberately, wanting to be seated at the same card table, in the same chair, creating a mirror image of that October confrontation. Ray stood by the door, and this time there was no pretense about the security. 4 men were visible in the hallway outside. Another 6 were positioned throughout the building. Everyone knew they were there, and everyone knew what that meant. Vincent Call arrived exactly at 8 o'clock. The transformation was striking. The cocky, aggressive young man who'd walked into this room with a gun and an attitude had been replaced by someone who looked older, harder, more aware of his own mortality. He wore an expensive suit, but it hung on him differently now, less like armor and more like a costume he was wearing for a performance he no longer believed in. He came alone, as promised. His hands were visible and empty. And when he looked at Holstein sitting at that card table, there was no defiance in his eyes, just calculation and a grudging respect that came from being thoroughly outplayed. You made your point, Call said without preamble, remaining standing near the door. Everything I tried, you countered. Every move I made, you were 3 steps ahead. I get it. You win. Holstein gestured to the empty chair across from him. Sit down, Vincent. If we're going to have this conversation, let's have it properly. Call hesitated, then moved to the chair and sat. Up close, the toll of the past 6 weeks was even more evident. Dark circles under his eyes. A nervous energy that suggested too much coffee and too little sleep. The look of a man who'd been fighting a war and slowly realized he was fighting a ghost. Every time he thought he'd landed a blow, there was nothing there. I underestimated you, Call said, and there was a frankness to his admission that was almost refreshing. Thought you were just another numbers runner who'd gotten lucky. Didn't realize you'd built something bigger than that. Most people make that mistake, Holstein replied, his tone neutral. They see a black man with money and assume it's temporary, assume it's something that can be taken. They don't see the foundation underneath. The relationships, the loyalty, the community investment, they just see the surface. Call nodded slowly. I'm leaving New York, going to Chicago, maybe Detroit. Somewhere I can start fresh, build my own operation without stepping on toes that can kick back this hard. Smart choice, Holstein said. But before you go, I need to know you understand why you failed. Not for my ego, I don't need that. But because if you don't understand it, you'll make the same mistake in the next city and the next until someone less forgiving than me decides to end you permanently. I'm listening, Call said, and he genuinely seemed to be. Holstein leaned forward, his hands folded on the table between them. You came after me with violence and intimidation, because that's what worked for you everywhere else. In the Irish neighborhoods, in the Italian territories, that's the currency of power. You kill enough people, you scare enough people, and eventually they give you what you want. He paused, making sure Call was following. But Harlem doesn't work that way, not because we're softer or weaker, we're not, but because we've survived things that would have broken other communities. Police brutality, economic depression, race riots, systematic exclusion from every legitimate avenue of success. Violence? We've seen violence that would make your worst day look like a schoolyard scuffle. Call's jaw tightened, but he didn't interrupt. So when you walked in here 6 weeks ago with that gun, Holstein continued, you thought you were bringing overwhelming force. But all you were bringing was more of the same thing we've been dealing with our entire lives. Another white man with a weapon telling us what we can and can't have. Another threat that we'd either submit or die. Holstein's voice hardened slightly. The mistake you made was thinking that fear of death was the ultimate leverage. But for people who've been living under the threat of death their entire lives, lynchings, police shootings, mob violence, death stops being the worst thing that can happen. There are worse things than dying, like living without dignity, like bowing to men who don't respect you, like letting the next generation inherit a world where they're still on their knees. The room was absolutely silent except for the distant sound of music from the ballroom. Call sat completely still, absorbing words that were rewriting his understanding of how power actually worked in this city. I built what I built, Holstein said, his voice softening, by understanding that real power doesn't come from making people afraid of what you'll do to them. It comes from making them believe in what you'll do for them. Every numbers runner who works for me knows I'll post his bail if he's arrested. Every family in Harlem knows that if they're short on rent, there's someone they can talk to. Every church knows that if their roof needs fixing, there's funding available. He gestured broadly, encompassing not just the room, but all of Harlem beyond it. That's what you were really trying to take from me. Not just money or territory, you were trying to take the trust of an entire community. And that's not something you can steal with a gun. Call sat in silence for a long moment, processing everything Holstein had said. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight of understanding that hadn't been there before. So what now? You've won. You've dismantled everything I tried to build against you. You could have had me killed a dozen times over the past 6 weeks. Why am I still breathing? Holstein smiled slightly, the expression carrying neither warmth nor malice, just the calm certainty of a man who'd already decided how this story would end. Because you're more valuable to me alive than dead. Every mobster, every gangster, every two-bit criminal who thinks about coming after what I've built needs to hear this story. Not the story of Vincent Call getting gunned down in Harlem. That would make you a martyr, a cautionary tale about how dangerous I am. No, they need to hear the story of Vincent Mad Dog Call, the man who terrorized half of New York, who walked into Harlem thinking he could take what he wanted and walked out having learned respect. He stood up from the table, extending his hand across the worn surface. Go to Chicago. Build something there. And when people ask why you left New York, tell them the truth. That you met a man who taught you the difference between fear and respect, between taking and earning, between ruling and leading. Call looked at the extended hand for a moment, then stood and shook it. The grip was firm, brief, and carried the weight of an understanding that transcended their confrontation. When he released Holstein's hand and turned toward the door, he paused one final time. For what it's worth, Call said, not quite looking back. If I'd known what you'd really built here, I never would have come after you in the first place. I know, Holstein replied. That's why I'm letting you leave. The door closed behind Vincent Call for the second and final time. He walked through the Renaissance ballroom, past the dancers and the music, past the security that watched him but didn't interfere, and out onto 138th Street, where the November cold bit at his face. He would board a train the next morning, heading west toward a future that looked nothing like the New York conquest he'd imagined. Vincent Call would never return to Harlem. He'd die less than 3 months later in a phone booth in Manhattan, gunned down by associates of Dutch Schultz in an unrelated dispute. But in those final weeks of his life, he told the story of his confrontation with Casper Holstein to anyone who would listen, not as a defeat, but as a lesson learned. The legend of the Bolito King spread through those retellings, growing larger and more mythic with each iteration. Casper Holstein remained in that back room for several minutes after Call left, smoking a cigar and reflecting on what had just transpired. Ray eventually joined him, sitting in the chair Call had vacated. You think he'll keep his word about leaving? Ray asked. Doesn't matter if he does or doesn't, Holstein replied. The point's been made. Every wise guy in New York now knows that coming after Harlem means going to war with something bigger than they can handle. Not because we're more violent, but because we're more organized, more connected, more invested in protecting what we've built. Holstein stood and moved to the window, looking down at the street below, where life continued its normal rhythm. That's the real legacy of tonight, Ray. Not that we defeated Vincent Call, that's just one battle. The legacy is that we proved something essential, that a black man in this city can build power that respects the community instead of exploiting it, and that power is more durable than anything built on fear alone. The two men left the room together, walking out into the ballroom where the band was playing and couples were dancing, and life in Harlem continued with the resilient joy that had always defined the neighborhood. No one in that room knew that history had just been made in the back office. No one knew that the confrontation that started 6 weeks ago had finally reached its conclusion. But they would know soon enough. Because stories like this, stories about dignity defended, respect earned, and power used responsibly, these were the stories that communities needed. These were the stories that got told on stoops and in barbershops, that got passed down from fathers to sons, that became part of the collective memory of what Harlem could be when its people stood together. The moment the gun spoke at point blank that October evening, Vincent Call thought he was writing a story about conquest and submission. But Casper Holstein understood something deeper. He was writing a story about what happens when a community finds a leader who's willing to stand unafraid, who understands that true power comes not from the ability to take life, but from the commitment to improve it. Harlem would never be the same after that moment. Not because violence had been avoided, but because a different kind of power had been demonstrated, the power of dignity, of community, of standing firm in the face of threats that would have broken lesser men.